In the fall of 1848, as workmen demolished the abandoned St. Mary's Academy for Young Girls in Salem, Massachusetts, they discovered a secret that would haunt the town for generations. Hidden deep beneath the floor of the Academy's chapel in a lead-lined box were 47 tiny leather-bound diaries, each named after a different girl. Inside were detailed descriptions of unspeakable horrors. But what horrified investigators most were the meticulously kept guest books, which listed the names of prominent figures in New England's political elite. The state of Massachusetts immediately sealed the entire discovery, citing public safety. And to this day, the records remain locked in the state archives. What I'm about to tell you is a compilation of never-before-seen testimonies, documents that powerful families tried to bury, and the final confession of a woman who carried a secret for 60 years. If you're someone who craves the truth, who's willing to look into the dark side of American history, where innocence, power, and morality are turned upside down, then this is the story for you. But I must warn you, what happened at St. Mary's Academy will shake the deepest notions of decency, honor, and trust in 19th century New England. Before we dive into the abyss of evil hidden beneath the veneer of morality, don't forget to subscribe if you're brave enough to pursue the truth that others dare not tell. And leave a comment telling me which state you're hearing this story from, because the horror could have happened anywhere. Now, let me go back in time to a time when evil wore the mask of virtue. Salem, Massachusetts in 1811, still scarred by the witch trials of 1692, was struggling to re-establish itself as a center of moral and educational excellence. The main families of Salem, ambitious as they were eager to restore the town's reputation in the eyes of New England society. And into this renaissance, the Fairfaxes arrived bringing impeccable credentials and a vision that captivated the upper classes. Victoria Fairfax was a striking woman, tall and elegant, with steely gray eyes that seemed to penetrate the soul. Born into a wealthy Virginia planter family, she received the best education available to women of her time, studying literature and languages in Philadelphia, then spending 2 years in London, studying advanced educational philosophy. Her husband, Dr. Cornelius Fairfax, died in the Charleston yellow fever epidemic, leaving her with a large fortune and a burning desire to devote the rest of her life to uplifting the morals of women. When Victoria announced that she would establish St. Mary's Academy for Young Women in Salem, the local religious authorities were ecstatic. A woman of high character, willing to teach orphans and poor girls for free, but also accepting students from prominent families, was just what the town needed to restore its honor. The academy would not only teach reading, music, French, and home economics, but would also emphasize moral instruction in a strict Protestant spirit. The house Victoria chose for the academy was as controversial as Salem itself. It was a grand 3-story Georgian mansion on Beacon Hill, built in 1787 by merchant Samuel Hartwell, who had made his fortune trading with China. After his death in 1809, the house was left empty, its windows staring like dead eyes out at Salem Harbor. Rumor had it that the place was cursed. The 3 families who had lived there had all left in haste, saying the strange sounds and oppressive atmosphere had become unbearable. But Victoria was not fazed by the rumors. She bought the building for a pittance and began extensive renovations. A new chapel was added, complete with stained glass depictions of saints. The dormitory was expanded to accommodate 30 students. The dining room could accommodate 50, and most notably, a third-floor private suite. Victoria called it the meditation room, where students could quietly contemplate their spirituality. Joining Victoria in her holy mission were two relatives who shared the same ideals. Her younger sister, Evangeline Fairfax, was slender with prematurely grey hair and a slight tremor in her hands from a childhood illness, but had an extraordinary talent for music and language. She was the principal teacher of these subjects, and her singing of hymns made even the most hardened sailors stop and listen when the sound rang out from the academy windows. The third was Bartholomew Fairfax, Victoria's brother-in-law, a tall, thin man with deep eyes and a thunderous voice. After 15 years of preaching throughout the South, he became the Academy's chaplain. His sermons on the depravity of the modern world and the dangers of the devil to young girls both made listeners shudder and felt that their children were safer at St. Mary's. The Academy officially opened on September 15th, 1811. The mayor of Salem, several state senators, and the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese were all present. With the autumn wind blowing her black silk skirts, Victoria gave a speech on the steps talking about an educational haven, where the mind and morals could be nurtured far from the temptations of the world. The first 23 girls were carefully selected, aged 12 to 17. Some were from well-to-do families paying a tuition of $50 a year, a large sum for a working-class person. But more than half were charity students, orphans, poor people, who received free education. Margaret Sullivan, 14, red-haired, blue-eyed, had worked in a textile mill after her Irish immigrant parents died in a fire. Invited to study on the condition that she help out, she could not believe that she had a chance to change her life. Priscilla Morses, 15 orphaned lives with her uncaring uncle, loves reading and is hungry for an education. Hannah Whitmore, 13, her father imprisoned, her mother run away, lives in a workhouse until Victoria herself comes to pick her up. The girls enter St. Mary's with hearts full of hope. None of them know that they have just stepped into an elaborate trap, where the one who promised to protect them is the first to betray them, and the magnificent mansion will become a prison, a nightmare, and for many, a grave. The first sign that something is wrong comes not from the students, but from Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a seamstress who lives at the foot of the hill. She regularly visits the academy to deliver fabrics and quietly observes. One morning in October 1812, exactly a year after the opening ceremony, she noticed something strange. Several elegant men quietly left the side gate leading to the third floor, where the private meditation room was located. They covered their faces, avoiding recognition. Curious, she began to pay more attention. Every night carriages arrived, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes up to 6, all without any identification marks, but extremely expensive. Then she noticed that the students gradually changed, from joyful to quiet, from lively to tired. Many of the girls had dull eyes, as if hypnotized. Some had bruises and scratches, hidden under their sleeves or explained as being from sewing. The most obvious change was in Margaret, the red-haired girl who used to chatter about her studies. That winter, she almost stopped talking. Her hair was faded. Her eyes were lifeless. Her face was pale, as if the life had been drained. There was something in Margaret's eyes that unsettled Mrs. Thornton. something hollow pleading, as if the girl were trying to send a message she dared not speak aloud. Then came the night of December 13th, 1812, a night Mrs. Thornton would never forget. Unable to sleep due to a persistent cough, she had risen from bed around midnight to make herself some chamomile tea. Standing at her kitchen window, waiting for the water to boil, she noticed a strange activity up on the hill. Flickering lights danced in the third-floor windows of the academy, not the steady glow of lanterns or candles, but an erratic shifting brightness like torches or fire. At first, she thought someone might be tending to a sick student, but then came the sound, the kind that drains the blood from your veins. Muffled screams, human, agonized. They came in waves, brief and intermittent, but unmistakable. They were coming from the direction of the Academy Chapel. Mrs. Thornton pressed her face to the cold window panes, straining to see. The stained glass chapel windows glowed with the same irregular light, and within, she could make out silhouettes, moving distorted, but frantic. The screaming continued on and off for nearly an hour, broken by unnatural silences that were somehow more chilling than the cries themselves. By morning, Mrs. Thornton tried to convince herself it had all been a fever dream brought on by illness and exhaustion. But 3 days later, during her regular delivery to the school, she learned that young Hannah Whitmore had died that very night, December 13th. Victoria Fairfax, dressed in mourning black, that made her look more statuesque than sorrowful, informed her curtly that the girl had succumbed to a sudden fever. Despite the best efforts of the Academy's physician, she said nothing could be done. A private funeral was held the next morning in the Academy Chapel. Only faculty and students were allowed to attend. Mrs. Thornton stood at a distance and listened as the hymns floated down the hill, notes that trembled not with grief, but with fear. Evangeline Fairfax's ethereal soprano led the choir, yet even her angelic voice couldn't conceal the desperate undertone that ran through every verse. Hannah was buried in the Academy Cemetery behind the main building beneath a simple stone cross, engraved only with her name and dates. No family attended. She had no family left. Victoria Fairfax mentioned this detail with what felt more like satisfaction than regret. In the weeks following Hannah's death, Mrs. Thornton began noticing alarming changes among other girls. They moved slower. Their eyes dulled. They spoke less barely at all. The same vacant, drained look that had overtaken Hannah now appeared in others. When she cautiously inquired about their health, Victoria dismissed her concerns with cool precision. The girls were merely adjusting, she explained, to the rigors of a proper moral education. Young ladies of unfortunate origin, she said, often require time to acclimate to refinement. Not all find the transition easy, but Mrs. Thornton wasn't reassured. She began keeping mental notes, tracking which girls seemed to be wasting away. A pattern quickly emerged. The most affected were always the poorest, the ones with no family, no advocates, nowhere to go if they wished to leave. The paying students, though noticeably quieter than when they'd arrived, still had some color in their cheeks and spark in their eyes. They were subdued, but not broken. But the charity girls, those from the streets, The poor houses, the orphan wards were fading. By February 1813, the pattern turned deadly again. 2 more students died within a single week. On a Tuesday morning, Priscilla Morse, the thoughtful girl with the love for books, was found lifeless in her bed. It was said she died peacefully in her sleep. 3 days later, Mary Catherine O'Brien, another Irish orphan, succumbed to brain fever after suffering violent seizures. Both girls were laid to rest behind the chapel, given the same sparse funeral rites as Hannah. Once again, the deaths were reported to authorities. But because the Academy's physician, Dr. Edmund Fairfax, was also the district coroner, the causes were listed as natural. No investigation followed. Mrs. Thornton was torn between the gnawing suspicion in her heart and the knowledge that she was merely a seamstress with nothing but troubling observations. Who would believe her? Who would dare accuse Victoria Fairfax, a woman admired for her virtue, celebrated for her philanthropy, and courted by clergy and civic leaders? Everyone praised the Academy. Salem's pastors spoke of its piety. Politicians touted it as a model of charity. No one saw or wanted to see what might be hiding behind the chapel walls. But Mrs. Thornton remembered the screams. She remembered the flickering light. And deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong on Beacon Hill. Something too well hidden to prove. Something too monstrous to imagine. But the truth was only beginning to stir. And when it finally clawed its way into daylight, it would be far more horrifying than even Mrs. Thornton's nightmares had prepared her for. By the spring of 1813, an eerie quiet had settled over St. Mary's Academy, as if the stone walls themselves had absorbed the cries and sorrow within, and now pressed them back out as suffocating silence. The deaths, 3 and 4 months, should have shaken the place to its core. But life continued carefully curated, as though nothing had happened. Victoria Fairfax appeared unshaken. Observers described her as composed, even inspired. She spoke often of trials sent by God to test the faithful, urging her remaining students to see suffering as a stepping stone to salvation. Her sermons became more intense, focused on sacrifice, obedience, and the cleansing power of suffering. Your past lives, she would proclaim from the pulpit, her steel-gray eyes, slicing through the room, were steeped in poverty, confusion, sin. That darkness has left stains on your soul. Only through the most rigorous spiritual discipline can you be cleansed. Her voice would rise to a fierce crescendo. The path to redemption is narrow. Not all will survive the journey, but those who do shall reap glories beyond comprehension. The girls listened with blank faces. They had learned not to react. Emotion was dangerous. Curiosity was punished. Questions, especially about the Academy's routines or restrictions, earned you silent, brutal consequences. Girls who pushed too far were reassigned to humiliating chores, forced to scrub floors with lye soap that left their hands raw, made to labor in the garden under the summer sun, or worst of all, locked for hours in the meditation rooms on the 3rd floor. Alone with their sins, their fears, and the cold stone silence. Margaret Sullivan, now 15, was a shadow of the spirited girl who had entered St. Mary's Academy 18 months earlier. Her red hair hung dull and uneven, her once bright eyes dulled to ash. But it wasn't just her appearance that had changed. It was her very presence. Margaret had become a master of emotional concealment. She moved through the academy like a ghost, trapped in familiar corridors, quiet, unobtrusive, and unreadable. She spoke only when addressed, and even then her words were measured, her tone flat. Behind those guarded eyes, however, her mind remained keen and watchful, and what she observed disturbed her deeply. Margaret had begun to detect patterns in the academy's rigid routines, patterns others either missed or dared not question. Chief among them was the recurring selection of certain students for what Evangeline Fairfax referred to as special instruction, always conducted in the third-floor chambers, always after nightfall. These sessions took place long after classes ended, and the building had settled into its hush. The chosen girls would vanish upstairs immediately after dinner, and not return until well after midnight. When they did, their movements were slow and dazed, their eyes glazed with the same haunted emptiness that had preceded the deaths of Hannah Priscilla and Mary Catherine. More unsettling still was the pattern Margaret began to connect between these nocturnal sessions and the arrival of the mysterious gentlemen in unmarked carriages. She'd come to realize that the side entrance which led directly to the third-floor chambers was never used during the day. All daytime visitors were received through the main parlor in full view with proper ceremony. But after dark, it was always the side door. Always those elegant, shadowy men, the students who were summoned multiple times, began showing signs that couldn't be chalked up to mere fatigue. They picked at their food with no appetite. They complained of chronic headaches, nausea, and aching joints. Several developed a fine tremor in their hands, eerily similar to Evangeline's own nervous twitch. When questioned, Dr. Edmund Fairfax explained that these were signs of spiritual attunement proof. He said that the girls' souls were becoming more sensitive to divine presence, shedding their earthly burdens. It was the price of transcendence, he claimed, but to Margaret, it looked like sickness, suffering, and fear. Life at the academy during this period followed a crushing, merciless schedule. Every moment of the day was accounted for, designed to sap the students' energy and isolate them from one another. The bell rang at 5:00 a.m. sharp for morning chapel. Breakfast consisted of weak tea and a crust of dry bread. From 7:00 a.m. to 6:00 p.m., classes occupied their every hour, broken only by a midday meal, thin soup, and more bread. Evenings were reserved for moral instruction, long punishing sessions, where Bartholomew Fairfax read selected religious tracts in a booming voice, while the girls sat in absolute silence. Questions were forbidden, commentary was punished. The goal, it seemed, was not enlightenment, but obedience. The exhausting routine left the students too drained to think, too weary to resist, and too fearful to form the bonds of friendship that might have given them strength. Any attempt at whispered conversation or passing notes was swiftly discovered and met with brutal punishments, solitary confinement, extra labor, or public humiliation. But still, resistance flickered in secret places. Despite the fear, a quiet rebellion began to take shape, using gestures, eye contact, and coded phrases exchanged during monitored tasks. A hidden network of communication emerged among the students, and at the center of it stood Margaret Sullivan. As one of the Academy's longest surviving charity students, she carried a certain quiet authority. She used that position to collect and share information, building piece by piece a clearer picture of the nightmare they were all trapped in. Through this underground web, Margaret uncovered the dark truth behind the special instruction. The girls described drinking strange tea, bitter, metallic, and thick on the tongue. Moments later, they would feel dizzy, unsteady, their minds clouded. What happened next was often fragmented memories, blurred at the edges like smoke. But certain details returned again and again. They were made to change into white garments, thin and ceremonial like burial shrouds. They were taken to candle-lit chambers where incense burned thick in the air and prayers were chanted in foreign tongues none of them could understand. And always the gentlemen were there. The men were well-dressed, well-spoken, and carried themselves with the refinement of scholars or statesmen. But behind the polished accents and immaculate coats, their eyes betrayed something else. Something hungrier. Something inhuman. The girls could not name it, but they felt it instinctively. A cold, ravenous intent. Margaret listened, collected, remembered. And the more she learned, the clearer it became whatever was happening in those third-floor chambers. It was not about education. It was not about God. It was about control, exploitation, ritual, and it was killing them. The gentlemen, those refined, anonymous men who arrived under the cover of night, did more than observe. They sat in high-backed chairs arranged around the perimeter of the third-floor chambers, their silhouettes cast long and flickering by candlelight. Sometimes they joined the prayers. Sometimes they murmured unfamiliar phrases in unison with the Fairfax siblings. But always they held themselves apart, aloof, superior, as though they were not merely guests, but authorities presiding over something ancient and exacting. By the time winter turned to spring of 1813, Margaret Sullivan had come to a harrowing realization. What she and the other girls faced was far more insidious than religious fanaticism or institutional cruelty. This was not a school, and it certainly wasn't a sanctuary. It was a machine, a ritualistic engine, fueled by the slow, deliberate breakdown of young women. They weren't students. They were sacrifices. The Academy's pristine image was a mask, and behind it lay something unspeakably cruel. A system designed not to nurture virtue, but to devour innocence. The truth hit Margaret with a force that was both terrifying and strangely empowering. She could feel the same symptoms now creeping into her own body, the tremors, the weakness, the fog that clouded her thoughts. She had seen it happen to Hannah, to Priscilla, to Mary Catherine. And now it was happening to her. But Margaret Sullivan had survived fire, poverty, and abandonment. She had endured the mills and the orphanage. She could not let herself vanish into silence like the others. So she began to plan. It was a plan born not of hope, but of desperation. A final attempt to break the cycle, to escape, or at the very least, ensure that someone outside these walls would know what St. Mary's truly was. She didn't yet know how or when the opportunity would come. But when it did, she would be ready. And when that opportunity arrived, it came in the form of a woman who would change everything. Her name was Miss Constance Hartwell, and her arrival at the Academy in September of 1813 marked the beginning of a chain of events that Victoria Fairfax had not foreseen and could not control. Constance Hartwell was not a student. She was an instructor brought on to teach mathematics and natural philosophy to the older girls. Her hiring broke from tradition for years. All teaching at the academy had been conducted by members of the Fairfax family or trusted affiliates under their strict oversight. That Victoria Fairfax would permit an outsider into her inner sanctum was on its own a startling deviation. Constance was 24 years old, the daughter of a wealthy Boston merchant, and possessed an education that few women in New England could rival. She had attended Miss Willard's Female Seminary in Troy, New York, a school that championed progressive thinking and intellectual rigor. There she had been encouraged to question, to explore, and to engage with the world as an intelligent being, not just as a moral project. In short, she was everything St. Mary's feared. Her reasons for accepting the position were both practical and idealistic. The salary Victoria offered was generous, far above what other schools would pay a woman even one as qualified as she. And Constance believed deeply in the importance of education, especially for girls without privilege. The idea of helping disadvantaged young women appealed to both her compassion and her principles. Her father had objected at first. He thought it unbecoming for a woman of her class to work at all. But Constance, equal parts intelligent and stubborn, had insisted. She argued that teaching would sharpen her leadership skills and help her understand people skills she believed would be useful whether she became a headmistress or a wife. From the moment she stepped into the academy, she sensed something was off. Her students, intelligent though they clearly were, responded with an eerie passivity. When she posed open-ended questions or introduced new concepts, they did not engage with curiosity or debate. Instead, they stared blankly and offered only memorized facts recited mechanically without understanding or emotion. At first, Constance assumed they were simply shy or unaccustomed to her teaching style. But as the weeks passed, the pattern persisted. More troubling still was their aversion to inquiry. Not only did they fail to ask questions, they seemed afraid to. As if the very act of wondering, of thinking freely, had been drilled out of them. She had seen vibrant minds before. She had nurtured them. And she knew what it looked like when intelligence was stifled. It wasn't natural. Someone had taught these girls to fear their own thoughts. At first, she attributed it to the rigid religious framework of the school. The Fairfax family clearly placed spiritual obedience above intellectual development. Still, there was something beyond discipline at work here. Something deeper, darker, and it was growing harder for Constance to ignore. Constance Hartwell had been raised in a devout Congregationalist household. She understood the importance of moral education, of nurturing both the intellect and the soul. She did not flinch from the idea of spiritual discipline. On the contrary, she valued it. But as the autumn of 1813 deepened, she began to sense something far beyond the bounds of ordinary religious instruction at work within St. Mary's Academy. The first undeniable sign came during a mathematics lesson in mid-October. One of her most promising pupils, Sarah Patton, had always shown a remarkable aptitude for numbers. At 16, Sarah was sharp, methodical, and unusually perceptive, until quite suddenly, she wasn't. That day, Constance noticed Sarah struggling to complete even basic arithmetic. Her hands trembled with each stroke of the pencil, and she frequently lost her place mid-calculation, blinking as though trying to clear fog from her vision. Concerned, Constance approached, gently crouching beside her desk. "Sarah," she asked softly, "are you feeling all right?" The girl paused, her pale fingers clenching the edge of her slate. Then she glanced toward the classroom door, fear flashing across her features. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartwell," she whispered, barely audible. "It's just, sometimes my mind feels cloudy, like there's a fog inside my head, and I can't think clearly anymore." There was a long pause before she added, "Dr. Fairfax says it means my spirit is being purified. But I used to think better before I came here." That confession chilled Constance to her core. From that moment forward, she began scrutinizing her students more closely. What she saw unsettled her. So many of them bright girls with sharp minds and eager dispositions now moved through their days as if drugged. Their skin had grown pale, their energy faded, their eyes dull and glassy. Several exhibited the same slight tremor she had seen in Evangeline Fairfax's hands. Many had lost weight, and an alarming number reported constant headaches, stomach pain, and fatigue. The symptoms reminded her horrifyingly of what she had seen during the cholera outbreak in Boston, not cholera's distinct signs, but that same unmistakable look of systemic poisoning. And yet, the academy insisted they were well fed, well cared for, and simply undergoing rigorous moral and intellectual formation. As her concern deepened, Constance attempted to understand the school's full layout and routines. That's when she encountered another troubling restriction. Though she had been granted living quarters on the second floor, she soon learned that the third floor was strictly off limits to all staff, except for the Fairfaxes themselves. Curious, she once asked Victoria Fairfax if she might use one of the upper rooms for private tutoring. A harmless enough request, she thought. Victoria's response was immediate and unnerving. "Miss Hartwell," she said, her steel grey eyes locking onto Constance's face with unnerving intensity, "I trust you understand the necessity of boundaries in a spiritual institution such as ours. The third floor contains meditation chambers reserved for those undergoing advanced instruction. That atmosphere is consecrated. We cannot permit secular activities to contaminate it, however well-intentioned." Her tone was polite, but the meaning was clear. The third floor was forbidden. And more than that, sacred in some strange, deeply guarded way. That conversation removed all doubt from Constance's mind. Something was being hidden, and the Fairfax family would do anything to keep it so. Over the following weeks, she began observing the academy more deliberately, especially at night. She started to see for herself the rhythms and rituals Mrs. Thornton had once described. The flickering lights, the odd shadows in the windows, the figures slipping through side entrances beneath cover of darkness. It was during one of these late-night observations that Constance's path finally crossed with Margaret Sullivan. In a moment that would forge an unlikely but powerful alliance. It was a stormy November night. Rain beat against the academy's windows in sheets, and the wind keened like a mourning voice through the shutters. Constance had been returning from the library, a book tucked beneath her arm. when she saw a shape moving stealthily down the dim corridor that led toward the side entrance, the same entrance she had never once been permitted to use. The figure moved cautiously, almost floating through the dark. At first, Constance thought it might be a member of the faculty, until the light from the wall sconce revealed the truth. It was a student, but not in the usual grey wool uniform. She wore a white gown, thin and flowing, that glowed softly in the low lamplight like a shroud. The sight stopped Constance cold. The girl didn't see her at first. She walked with a dreamlike stillness, as if in a trance, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. Then, in a sudden flick of motion, she turned, and their eyes met. It was Margaret Sullivan, and in her gaze, Constance saw not confusion, but recognition, desperation, and something more, a plea. Constance followed. At a distance, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting that lined the academy's dim corridors. From the shadows, she watched as the pale figure, now unmistakably Margaret Sullivan, approached the side entrance and pressed her ear carefully to the wooden door. The girl remained perfectly still for several long minutes, clearly straining to listen to whatever was happening beyond. Then, just as quietly, Margaret turned and began retracing her steps. When she spotted Constance standing silently in the shadows, both young women froze. For a moment, the hallway was suspended in a tense, motionless silence. Two souls caught in the same dangerous current, suddenly aware of one another. Neither moved, neither spoke. But then Margaret stepped forward slowly and deliberately, her green eyes meeting Constance's with a look of fierce resolve. Beneath her haunted expression was something unmistakable trust. "Miss Hartwell." Margaret whispered, her voice nearly drowned by the steady hiss of rain against the academy windows. "I need to speak with you, but not here. Not now." She glanced over her shoulder, then leaned in. "Tomorrow," she continued, barely audible during your mathematics class, "ask me to stay after to discuss my work. I have things to tell you, things you need to know." Then, without another word, she slipped back into the shadows, vanishing into the gloom like a ghost returning to her grave. The next day, Constance could barely contain her tension as her mathematics lesson unfolded. Each equation and recitation felt like a distraction, a delay. But finally, the class ended. She dismissed the other girls, then turned to Margaret, who remained seated at her desk, waiting. "Miss Sullivan," Constance said carefully, "please stay behind. I'd like to review some of your recent work." As the door closed behind the last student, Margaret stood, walked forward, and began to speak. What she revealed in the next hour would forever alter Constance Hartwell's understanding of the world she had entered. The calm, methodical tone in which Margaret delivered her account only underscored the horror of what she had witnessed. She began by describing the so-called special instruction sessions, those late-night summons to the third floor. Her explanation was disturbingly precise, as though she had been cataloguing each detail in secret. She spoke of the pattern of illnesses of the girls who returned from these sessions with clouded minds and shaking limbs, of the timing that aligned perfectly with the mysterious gentlemen who arrived in unmarked carriages. But it was Margaret's theory about the Academy's true purpose that sent a chill through Constance's very bones. According to Margaret, St. Mary's Academy was not an institution of education or moral refinement at all. It was a procurement operation meticulously disguised to supply young women to the elite for purposes too vile to be spoken aloud. The daily lessons, the spiritual sermons, the moral instruction. It was all a carefully orchestrated facade, a gilded cage behind which unimaginable abuse took place under the cover of religious virtue. They're not just killing us, Miss Hartwell, Margaret said flatly, her voice unwavering. They're destroying us first. Our minds, our will, our ability to resist or escape. And once we're too weak to fight, they use us until we die. She paused, her eyes hollow but fierce. Hannah, Priscilla, Mary, Catherine. They didn't die of fever or brain sickness. They were murdered as surely as if someone had put a knife through their hearts. Constance listened in silence, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The trembling hands, the clouded eyes, the ritualistic isolation, the rigid control over movement and speech. It all made sense now. Too much sense. There was no longer room to dismiss these suspicions as the product of stress or imagination. This was deliberate evil carried out with precision beneath the veil of religious authority and moral superiority. And worse still, the perpetrators were untouchable. Victoria Fairfax was a pillar of the community lauded for her piety and philanthropy. Evangeline was a gentlewoman artist, admired for her musical grace. Bartholomew was a renowned preacher, his fiery sermons quoted in pulpits across New England. No one would believe they were capable of such atrocities, especially not based on the word of a charity girl and a young schoolteacher. The Academy had already proven it could silence victims without consequence, burying its crimes beneath polished sermons and manicured appearances. If they were going to expose the truth, Constance and Margaret would need more than conviction. They would need evidence, tangible, undeniable proof. And they would need to find it before the Fairfax family realized what they were doing. Because if they were caught, they would be the next ones buried in the cemetery behind the chapel. As winter gripped Salem in the final days of 1813, two women played a perilous game of cat and mouse, not as hunters, but as prey. Margaret Sullivan and Constance Hartwell, bound together by a grim truth and a shared desperation, moved quietly through the shadowed halls of St. Mary's Academy, gathering the proof that might save the living and expose a monstrous empire of cruelty hidden beneath a facade of Christian virtue. They were not naive about the dangers. Their enemies were powerful, well-connected, and utterly without mercy. And yet, inside the Academy's cold stone walls, a silent rebellion had begun. Despite their vastly different origins, one the daughter of a Boston merchant, the other a penniless Irish orphan, their strengths complemented one another. Constance's official access to administrative areas and her perceived loyalty gave her cover, while Margaret's street-honed instincts and quiet cunning allowed her to navigate unnoticed through places no one thought to watch. Together, they formed an unlikely but potent intelligence network inside the very heart of the beast. Their first major breakthrough came not through discovery, but through deliberate infiltration. As an instructor, Constance was granted scheduled access to Victoria Fairfax's private office, ostensibly to prepare lesson plans and evaluate student progress. But behind that locked door, buried beneath lesson rosters and staff correspondence, a darker archive awaited one Constance would never have breached without Margaret's long-buried talents. In her childhood, on Salem streets, Margaret had survived by learning the art of the lockpick, stealing bread, slipping through cellar doors, hiding from constables. Now she used those same skills to open the most important desk in New England. What they found within turned fear into fury. Behind the veil of school reports and disciplinary notices lay a second set of records ledgers written in a cold, precise shorthand. It took time to decipher the code, but soon the horrifying pattern emerged. Each student was assigned a number, their development tracked not by academic performance, but by disturbing metrics, obedience levels, signs of resistance, mental pliability. Margaret's hands shook as she found her own record. Subject 12. MS, red-green. 15 years. Conditioning progressing slowly. Resistance above average. Recommend increased dosage and extended isolation. Client interest moderate but consistent. Estimated transition to final phase 3 to 4 months. There were no names, only subjects, evaluations, costs. No affection. No humanity. The girls were inventory catalogued with chilling detachment, like livestock in a barn or merchandise awaiting sale. And it got worse. One entire section of the ledgers detailed client preferences, written with the grotesque specificity of a tailor's order form. Some men favored younger girls, others wanted certain physical features. Some requested behavioral traits, defiant, timid, or most disturbingly broken. Every entry read like a menu of suffering, but the most damning material was hidden in a locked side drawer, a drawer they almost didn't open. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Personal correspondence from Victoria Fairfax written in her elegant flowing script letters that stripped away all pretense. One in particular, dated November 15th, 1813, was addressed only to the Honorable J.A. Its contents made both women physically ill. My dear friend, I am pleased to inform you that the young lady you inquired about has made significant progress in her preparation. The temperament issues you mentioned have been largely resolved through our specialized instruction methods, and I believe she will meet your exacting standards within the fortnight. As always, our mutual discretion ensures your association with our institution remains entirely confidential. Your usual contribution of $200 will be most gratefully received. VF, there was no ambiguity, no misinterpretation. This was not education. It was trafficking. With each page, the scale of the operation became more evident and more horrifying. St. Mary's Academy was the beating heart of a systemic enterprise, supplying conditioned girls to powerful clients across New England. This was not isolated abuse. It was commerce. Refinement through trauma. Obedience through pharmacology. The rituals. The special instruction. The drugs in the tea. It all served one goal: to break the girls down, strip them of resistance, and deliver them compliant, silenced, and marketable to men who could pay. And when a girl failed to meet expectations, she didn't graduate, she died. Just as Hannah had, just as Priscilla and Mary Catherine had. Their deaths were not tragedies, they were cost management. The ledgers included notes about non-viable subjects being given measured overdoses of laudanum or other substances usually administered by Dr. Edmund Fairfax, who doubled as physician and coroner. A single entry noted subject terminated cited brain fever in death records. No further complications. Margaret's face was pale as ash as she read. Constance felt a hollowness grow in her chest, as if something essential in the world had shifted beneath her feet. They had come looking for evidence. What they found was the black heart of a criminal empire. The question now was not just how to gather more proof, but how to survive long enough to use it. Because if Victoria discovered what they had seen, they wouldn't be disciplined. They'd be next. The deaths at St. Mary's Academy were on paper, unfortunate acts of God explained away with tidy terms like fever, brain sickness, or spiritual exhaustion. But those papers had all been signed by Dr. Edmund Fairfax, whose brief clinical examinations lasted no more than 10 minutes and always led to the same conclusion: no investigation required. But as Constance Hartwell and Margaret Sullivan pieced together the fragments of evidence, they realized their own movements were being watched. What began as subtle observations from Victoria Fairfax questions about teaching methods, lesson plans, and student behavior soon evolved into something sharper. In faculty meetings, Victoria's inquiries took on the precision of a surgeon probing for a wound. She maintained her pleasant tone, her ladylike composure, but beneath her gaze, Constance felt the unmistakable presence of a predator searching for weakness. The pressure escalated in January 1814, when another student died, and this time, the lie unraveling around her was impossible to ignore. Elizabeth Morrison had only been at the academy for 4 months. A quiet, intelligent 14-year-old from a poor farming family. She had shown promise in Constance's classroom. Though pale and clearly fatigued, Elizabeth had still demonstrated the spark of genuine curiosity, a rare quality among the increasingly dulled minds of St. Mary's students. On a cold Tuesday morning, Elizabeth was found dead in her bed. No warning, no illness, no screams. She had simply not woken up. Dr. Fairfax's cursory exam lasted less than 10 minutes. His verdict, heart failure due to spiritual excitement. The phrase itself was absurd, a contradiction dressed in piety. Constance had seen Elizabeth the day before, alert, present, lucid. That girl had not died of natural causes. Worse, Margaret had warned her. Elizabeth had just completed 3 consecutive nights of special instruction. She hadn't returned the same. She wept in her sleep. She had asked in whispers to write to her parents, only to be denied by Evangeline Fairfax, who claimed such contact would interfere with spiritual development. To Constance, that denial was a death sentence in disguise. The night after Elizabeth's funeral, as cold wind rattled the chapel windows and snow blanketed Beacon Hill, Constance made her choice. She would infiltrate a special instruction session. It was madness, reckless, possibly fatal. But documents and whispers were not enough. Not anymore. The world outside would never believe what was happening here unless someone saw it unless someone could describe it with unshakable clarity. That witness would be her. Margaret was horrified. "It's too dangerous," she warned. "If they find you, if they even suspect, they won't hesitate." But Constance had inherited more than just intellect from her merchant father. She had inherited hid steel. "We need proof," she replied. "Not theories, not suspicions. Evidence." And so the plan was set. The opportunity came on February 8th, 1814, when the coded ledgers listed a rare event, a large gathering involving multiple clients. Margaret's student network had confirmed it. 6 girls had been selected for the session, including herself, and 2 others who had endured the academy the longest. The event would begin at 9:00 p.m. after the rest of the students had been locked in their dormitories, and the halls of the academy had fallen into their usual nighttime stillness. The plan was dangerous in its simplicity. Constance would hide in a storage closet on the 3rd floor, one that Margaret had identified as having a ventilation grate overlooking the main ritual chamber. From there, Constance would be able to observe everything. Margaret would attend the session as required, but had promised to fight the effects of whatever drug she was given in hopes of remembering details that Constance might miss. Every element depended on timing, silence, and luck. To explain her absence, Constance feigned a severe headache, requesting permission to retire early to her quarters. She told Evangeline she planned to rest and read by lamplight, reviewing student essays and preparing new lessons. It was a believable cover, and more importantly, one that would keep others from seeking her out. At 8:30, the halls dim and quiet. Constance left her room. She carried no candle. The only light came from the wall-mounted lamps flickering down the corridor. Her heart thudded in her chest as she made her way toward the servants' staircase, the narrow passage that led unnoticed by most to the 3rd floor. The stairs groaned beneath her weight. Every creak echoed like a gunshot. She paused after each step, listening, breathing shallowly, her hands trembling, not from fear alone, but from the weight of what she might soon witness. Behind her, the academy held its breath. Ahead of her, the truth waited, terrible, silent, and alive. The 3rd floor of St. Mary's Academy was dimly lit by oil lamps spaced at intervals along the corridor, their flickering light casting elongated shadows that danced against the paneled walls. The air was thick with the scent of incense, heady, oppressive, and something else beneath it, something chemical and wrong, a sweet, numbing aroma that reminded Constance of the ether a dentist had once used to sedate her as a child. It was a smell that promised oblivion. The walls themselves were lined with religious paintings, each depicting scenes of martyrdom, agony, and pious suffering. Saints burned at stakes, maidens flayed or crucified, the Virgin weeping over a bloodied Christ. It was not inspiration these images offered, it was warning. This is what becomes of those who resist. Constance found the storage closet she had scouted days earlier. Slipping inside, she closed the door with infinite care, her hands slick with sweat despite the chill. The room smelled of soap and old fabric. Cleaning brushes, folded linens, and candles were stacked neatly on the shelves. In the corner sat a wooden crate just tall enough. She dragged it beneath the wall's ventilation grate, climbing up slowly so as not to disturb the already precarious silence. From her perch, she could see directly into the chamber beyond. She was not prepared for what awaited her. At exactly 9:00 p.m., She heard the sound of voices, low, serious, and filled with ritual urgency. Footsteps echoed against the stone. Through the grate, she saw Evangeline Fairfax enter the room, her movements serene and deliberate as she carried a silver tray stacked with delicate porcelain cups. Drug tea, Constance realized. She had suspected as much before, but now there was no doubt. Next came Bartholomew Fairfax, towering and severe in ceremonial robes. The heavy fabric hung from his shoulders like the garb of a medieval inquisitor, embroidered with sigils Constance could not recognize. The air shifted when Victoria Fairfax entered. Gone was the black matronly gown of daily life. She now wore deep purple silk, the hem trailing behind her like the vestments of a high priestess. Symbols twisted, an arcane glimmered along the fabric, seeming to writhe in the candlelight. The chamber itself had been utterly transformed. The simple meeting room now resembled a corrupted chapel. Elaborate candelabras ringed the space, their flames flickering with malevolent energy. The walls were covered in black tapestries, embroidered with grotesque scenes. Children bound in vines, eyes weeping blood, angelic figures pierced through with thorns. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform cloaked in white silk. Surrounding it were chairs precisely arranged like pews around an altar. Constance's heart hammered as she saw the girls enter. 6 students led by Evangeline, all dressed in white gowns the same color as shrouds. Margaret was among them. So too was Sarah Peyton, her delicate face pale and slack, the signs of sedation obvious. All 6 moved as though underwater, their limbs heavy, their eyes unfocused. Whatever they had been given had dulled their senses, but not enough to spare them from what was to come. And then the clients arrived, 6 men, each entering through the side door with the familiarity of routine. All were well dressed, their coats tailored, their cravats immaculate. Their faces bore the easy confidence of men unaccustomed to consequence. Constance recognized 3, a wealthy Salem merchant, a Boston state legislator, and worst of all, a judge famous for his so-called moral integrity. The next 2 hours would scar Constance Hartwell in ways that no time, no logic, no future joy would ever fully erase. The special instruction was not religious. It was ritualized abuse cloaked in the language of piety. Each act of degradation was performed with ceremonial precision, as if adherence to a script somehow sanctified the horror. The drugged girls were touched, moved, and used in ways that made Constance's stomach twist, her eyes blur with furious tears. Bartholomew presided like a high priest, his voice droning in rhythmic cadence, instructing the participants with the same tone he might have used during a sermon. Evangeline played her harp and sang slow, haunting melodies that seemed to soothe the monsters as they worked. Victoria orchestrated it all. She was the director of the spectacle, adjusting lighting, repositioning girls, soothing clients with whispers and smiles. It was theater to her, a well-rehearsed production with a cast of the unwilling and an audience of the damned. The students were not seen as people. They were offerings, their pain framed as spiritual transcendence, a monstrous reimagining of salvation through suffering. By the time the final candle was snuffed and the clients departed through the discreet side exit, Constance could no longer feel her legs. She had remained frozen in her hiding place, watching every moment, every act, recording it in her mind, like a witness at a war crime tribunal. And now she knew the Fairfax operation was not just corrupt, it was systematic, powerful, and deeply entrenched. It extended beyond the academy walls into the courts, the legislature, the church. These were not isolated acts of abuse, but the workings of a refined, profitable industry. The next morning, February 14th, 1814, would mark the final turning point. When Constance awoke, she found a note slipped under her door. Its handwriting, precise, feminine, unmistakably Victoria's. Miss Hartwell, please join me in my office immediately after morning chapel. We have urgent matters to discuss regarding your future at this institution. The words were polite. The tone was professional. But Constance knew exactly what it meant. She dressed with trembling hands, wondering if Margaret had received a similar summons or if she had already been silenced. Chapel that morning was a macabre performance. Victoria spoke as she always did, but Constance now recognized the cracks in her composure, a slight tremor in her voice, white knuckles gripping the pulpit, eyes that scanned the congregation like a hawk counting its prey. Margaret was present, though clearly more sedated than usual. Her green eyes, normally burning with quiet intelligence, looked dull, unfocused. She swayed during the hymns, her mouth forming words she did not seem to hear. And when their gazes met across the pews, Constance saw it, the silent message of a girl who knew they had been caught. After chapel, Constance walked to Victoria's office with the steady gait of a woman walking toward the gallows. Victoria was already seated behind her mahogany desk, no longer pretending to be the kindly headmistress. Her face was calm, composed, like that of a predator savoring its cornered meal. "Please sit down, Miss Hartwell," she said smoothly, her voice like velvet wrapped around a blade. "We have a great deal to discuss." Constance obeyed, forcing her face into neutrality. Her heart pounded, her throat dry. But she had rehearsed for this over and over in her mind. If she was to survive, she would need every ounce of poise, cunning, and restraint she could summon. The final game had begun. But faced with Victoria Fairfax's gaze, sharp as a dagger honed on bone, Constance Hartwell knew instantly that deception was useless. "I trust," Victoria said smoothly, "that you found your recent evening explorations educational." She opened a leather-bound folder with deliberate poise, placing it between them on the desk, like a priest unveiling sacred texts. Constance's breath caught. She recognized the contents, immediately sketches of the third-floor chamber copies of encoded ledger entries, and most damning of all pages, filled with her own handwriting. Notes, diagrams, observations, conclusions. All the fruits of weeks spent in secrecy laid bare like a corpse before autopsy. The sight hollowed her. This wasn't just a breach. It was a catastrophic unraveling of everything she and Margaret had risked to build. And it could only mean one thing. Someone had betrayed them. Someone with access not only to her quarters, but to her confidence. "You look surprised." Victoria observed her voice, laced with theatrical amusement. "Did you truly believe that your little espionage operation would go unnoticed in a place where Information is the currency of survival. She tapped the folder gently with one lacquered fingernail. We've been watching you since your third week, Miss Hartwell. Every document you opened, every student you questioned, every midnight walk down the servant stairs. You were never as invisible as you imagined. The words struck Constance like a slap. They had been watched from the beginning, which meant the files they'd found, the ledgers, the letters, all of it had likely been allowed, perhaps even planted. Not stolen, but fed to them. And the chilling question, why? Victoria smiled as if reading her thoughts. You're wondering why we let you proceed. Why we didn't simply remove you when you became inconvenient. She leaned forward. The answer is simple. You were useful. A stress test. Your meddling helped us expose cracks in our protocols, identify weaknesses in Staff Titan surveillance procedures. And more importantly, you helped us uncover a growing problem among the students, as if summoned by the dark gods of consequence. The door creaked open. Bartholomew Fairfax stepped in. He looked even more spectral than usual, his robe clinging to his skeletal frame, casting deep hollows beneath his sunken eyes. Behind him came two broad-shouldered men, dressed not in livery, but in rough traveling coats. Their boots were muddy, their knuckles scarred, and their expressions blank with purpose. Enforcers. Miss Sullivan has been most cooperative, Bartholomew said, his tone dry and satisfied, like a man announcing a successful harvest. She gave us a detailed account of your methods, your discoveries, and most importantly, your intentions to reach the authorities. The words struck with a cruelty sharper than any blade. Margaret, the brave, brilliant girl who had risked everything, had she broken under interrogation, sold their truth to save her life. Constance felt the ground sway. But then something in Bartholomew's gaze, a flicker of something not quite triumph, made her hesitate. His expression was practiced, yes, but not whole, not certain. Was this a lie, a manipulation? Had Margaret betrayed her? Or was this part of something else? Before she could grasp the thought, Victoria circled the desk. She stood now directly in front of Constance, and the room seemed to shrink beneath her presence. She was tall, composed, radiant in her cruelty. The question, Miss Hartwell, she said, is what to do with you. Her tone was no longer performative. It was decisive. Your father is a man of influence, she continued. A disappearance would raise questions, inconvenient ones. We prefer to avoid such scrutiny. She stepped even closer, her breath a faint trace of lavender and something metallic. But your continued presence also poses unacceptable risks, which leaves us a third option. Her voice dropped silk over steel. You could join us. Constance blinked. We have operations in other cities, Victoria said. Enterprises that require educated minds. Minds like yours. With your connections and background, you could do very well. We are prepared to offer you authority, compensation, respect, she smiled. Not with joy, with certainty. It was not a choice. It was a test of corruption. To say yes would mean power, yes, but it would also mean complicity in everything she had witnessed. The teacups, the trembling hands, the crying girls, the ritualized rape disguised as spiritual devotion. To say no was to die. And yet, even in that moment, as the walls of the chamber closed in and death loomed like a blade waiting to fall, Constance felt a calm take hold, because if they were offering her this choice, it meant one thing. They weren't certain yet. They were trying to turn her, and that, she realized, might be the only advantage she had left. There was no third alternative, at least none that Victoria Fairfax was willing to acknowledge. Constance Hartwell. Her pulse a drumbeat in her ears, searched desperately for a response that might buy her time. A deflection, a delay, anything. But before she could speak, the corridor outside erupted into chaos. Shouts rang through the hallway. Doors slammed open. Heavy boots thundered across the floorboards like war drums. Victoria's expression faltered, slipping from predatory composure to sudden, sharp confusion, and then fear. The door burst open. A phalanx of men in blue uniforms swept into the office, led by a tall, grim-faced officer with a badge of the Massachusetts State Constabulary pinned to his chest. Behind him, Margaret Sullivan, alive. Her green eyes blazed with rage and purpose, her presence striking Constance like a lightning bolt of impossible hope. Victoria Fairfax, the lead officer, said with unflinching authority, "You are under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder." He turned his glare to the others. Bartholomew Fairfax, Evangeline Fairfax, you are also under arrest on the same charges. Then to the two rough men standing like stunned sentinels behind the Fairfaxes, "You will remain here for questioning." The moment shattered Victoria. Her poise dissolved. Her voice cracked. "This is preposterous." She snapped her pitch, rising to a shriek. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is a private institution, chartered by the Commonwealth." But the constable was unmoved. "Ma'am, we have sworn testimony, documentary evidence, and eyewitness accounts of criminal acts committed on these premises," he said, as two officers moved in to restrain Bartholomew. "You will come with us peacefully, or we will use force." As the officers began shackling the once untouchable Fairfax family, Margaret crossed the room toward Constance. Her expression was a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you," she whispered fiercely. 2 nights ago, when Bartholomew confronted me, I knew it was our only chance. They thought I was broken," she added, bitter and breathless, "that I'd do anything to save myself. So I gave them exactly what they wanted. And while they celebrated, I found a way to get word to the authorities." The audacity of it stunned Constance. Margaret had not betrayed her. She had saved them both. When cornered, she had confessed, selectively presenting herself as a frightened girl eager to cooperate. Her performance convinced the Fairfaxes to grant her access to restricted parts of the academy, including the side entrance, the only connection to the outside world. In the dead of night, while her captors believed her to be drugged and confined, Margaret slipped away and fled to the Salem Constabulary Station. Her report had been met with skepticism at first, but she'd come armed with details, names, dates, financial records, and a list of clients, men scheduled to visit the academy that very night. Judges, legislators, merchants, men whose reputations could not survive even the accusation, let alone arrest in the act. That prospect had galvanized the authorities. What began as reluctance had become urgency, and within hours a team was mobilized, armed with warrants, ready to storm the academy. And now the empire that Victoria Fairfax had so carefully constructed was falling apart, not in whispers, but in shouts and chains. Dr. Edmund Fairfax was arrested at his private practice before noon. Officers fanned out across Salem to secure ledgers, letters, and financial records. Students, once too frightened to speak, began telling their stories. Names were named, faces described, secrets spilled into the daylight. And as the Fairfax family was marched away under heavy guard, the network of powerful clients began to feel the grip of justice closing in. Some tried to flee. Others attempted to silence witnesses or burn records. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, and Margaret Sullivan had ensured there were too many eyes now watching. But perhaps the most damning evidence came not from ledgers or letters or hidden documents, but from someone the world had ignored, Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the Academy's seamstress. The same woman whose early suspicions had been dismissed as working-class hysteria. The woman they had mocked for her imagination. Her testimony, precise and patient, painted a picture that no jury could ignore. She remembered what the girls wore who escorted them, which doors opened late at night, and what she heard through the walls. The story she told, the story no one wanted to believe, was now impossible to deny. And St. Mary's Academy, once hailed as a sanctuary of faith and discipline, would soon be remembered as one of the most depraved criminal enterprises in American history. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the precedent it established that no institution, no matter how pious its reputation, no matter how powerful its benefactors, was above the law. The trial of the Fairfax family forced a reckoning across New England. It shattered illusions about class morality and authority, showing the public that evil can thrive not in shadows, but in plain sight, veiled by prayer, respectability, and ritual. The case became required reading in law schools, cited in debates about institutional transparency, and taught in civics classrooms as an example of what happens when systems fail to protect the most vulnerable. Margaret Sullivan, once a nameless charity girl with no future, became a national figure invited to speak before reform societies and women's assemblies from Philadelphia to Charleston. But she refused to let her fame become a distraction. Instead, she poured it into her life's work, the Sullivan School for Girls, which opened in 1816 and grew into one of the most respected institutions of its kind in the Northeast. Every student at the school was taught not just arithmetic and reading, but also how to recognize coercion, how to speak out, and how to protect others. Constance Hartwell, more reserved but no less resolute, became a quiet but influential force in education reform. She and her husband published essays and curricula that challenged the authoritarian norms of early 19th century pedagogy, and she was appointed to the newly formed Massachusetts Board of Educational Ethics, a body created in direct response to the St. Mary's scandal. Her work helped lay the groundwork for teacher accountability standards, student welfare inspections, and early child psychology in curriculum development. Both women remained close for the rest of their lives, bound not only by what they had survived, but by what they had built from the wreckage. As for St. Mary's Academy, its ruins became a place of pilgrimage for reformers, journalists, and grieving families. The park that replaced it was intentionally left simple. No statues, no grandeur, just a broad lawn, a few shade trees, and a stone monument carved with 43 names. At its base, the words that Constance herself had proposed. They were forgotten by the world, but not by history. Each year, on the anniversary of the trial's verdict, a candlelight vigil was held at the site, led first by Margaret and Constance, then by former students of the Sullivan School. Eventually, it became a tradition observed across Massachusetts, a symbol of the power of testimony, the necessity of vigilance, and the profound truth that even the most unimaginable darkness can be overcome by the courage of those who refuse to look away. And so, what began as a tale of horror became a story of transformation, a grim chapter in America's early history that forced a nation to confront the shadows behind its sanctuaries and gave rise to a movement that ensured those shadows would never again go unchallenged. It established that wealth, social position, and religious authority could not shield criminals from justice when brave souls are willing to speak. The conviction of the Fairfax family and their patrons proved that American justice, though often imperfect, can hold the powerful accountable. But it also exposed how easily institutions meant to protect can become weapons in the hands of those who prey on the weak. Evil often wears the mask of virtue. Respectability can be camouflage for cruelty. And the courage of those who risk everything for the truth is the only light that can pierce such darkness. In the words of Margaret Sullivan, spoken during her trial testimony, they thought we were powerless because we were poor, because we were young, because we were alone. But they forgot power can be found in truth, and truth can be enough when we stand together. Today, over 2 centuries later, we face many of the same challenges. Protecting the vulnerable, holding power accountable, recognizing when institutions fail the people they claim to serve. The girls who died at St. Mary's Academy were nearly erased from history, but now their names are carved in stone. Their voices, silenced by cruelty, are preserved in testimony and truth. And their story carries a single, enduring message. Remember us, learn from our sacrifice, and never again let evil be committed in the name of virtue, education, or faith. What do you think about this dark chapter in American history? Could such a scheme still exist today, hidden beneath respectability and sacred titles? If this story moved, you share it. Subscribe for more hidden histories and untold truths. And join the conversation, because history only changes when people start listening.